Great, awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name's Chaz Ballou. I'm one of the co-founders, along with Frank here, of Aptable. And we are here to talk about kind of like our view of the world in 2021 and what's going to happen. Um, Frank, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah. So just really briefly, we're going to be talking about some of our predictions that we've seen, both from analyzing the market, from our own customers. We're going to be talking about some technology trends, and uh, yeah, hope to tell you a little bit more in the slides to come.
Cool. All right, in terms of logistics, we have participants and I can see the participants, but we don't know exactly who everybody is, and it will really help us tailor, otherwise it's just going to be Frank and I talking to each other for an hour. Um, if you have questions or if you have context or if you have ideas or comments, please do drop them in the Q&A. It'll really help us respond to make this just like better, more informative, more useful for you as we go. If you want to, uh, as well, if you have anything that like you're wondering like what you would like to get out of this, you can drop that in as a question and we'll see it too. So I appreciate it. We'll have specifically some time for Q&A at the end here as well. We'll set aside some time for that. Okay, so uh, the bulk of today is going to be some slides and some discussion around. We tried to pick three big themes and three predictions, in the sense that we think are on the horizon and coming up in 2021. And for each of these, we'll go through. We'll put a little detail on it. We'll kind of talk more and more about sort of our view of the world. That's really what people have asked for in this webinar, is like, what are, if you were a founder of a 60-person Series A, Series B company in compliance and security, and you're working with all of these, vendors and customers in the cloud, or you're just in the middle of the security and compliance sort of domain, what do you think about the market? What do you think about what's going on? What do you see? What are you hearing from the market? So this is kind of Frank and I's take on, and the Aptable team's take on like what we're hearing from the market overall. The three predictions are around supply chains, basically vendor risk management and supply chains. The second risk is around automation, which I think we'll talk about this, but it's kind of an overused term. Automation can mean a lot of things, but I think we think automation is finally, coming into its own, and becoming the best version of itself. And the last point here is around sort of like fragmentation that we see in the compliance and security industry, and the emergence of platforms. I think a lot of companies out there are building features, not companies. So we'll get into each of these. Again, if any of these in particular resonate, or if there are particular issues or things you're wondering about as you go, your questions don't even need to be like fully formed questions. They can be comments too. You can put anything in the chat and that works. Okay, let's see. So this first prediction, we worded this as data networks decrease vendor risk, and it can take a bit to unpack. Here's some information to sort of digest here. The title of the slide said third-party services are cloud services are growing risk, and I think that, like, I don't know, Frank, I'd say like they're a risk and they're growing. Is the risk growing? Is it, I think, I don't know.
I think
What's
it's
your
a
impression? What's the quality, the sort of average quality in the bar for security? Are the vendors getting riskier, or are we just using more of them?
I think it's that we're using more of them, and that so I think there's three trends. That the first has been occurring since cloud adoption, which is that more and more services are moving to the cloud. So that means that customers of all sizes, especially enterprise companies, are depending on more cloud services. Those intermediate cloud services are themselves using more and more cloud services. And so the network of trust dependency between cloud services is just growing and becoming more interconnected. So whenever you're using one service, now there are dozens of cloud vendors backing that service that also impact your trust. So that's one of the trends. And then I think the other is simply both greater visibility into breaches that are occurring in the supply chain, as well as greater incentives to attack them. This is not something where it's just a matter of trying to compromise financial data. There's a lot more data value across every industry that are the subject of attacks. And so I think that's what we're seeing here. It's not that that the vendors are getting worse. It's that there's more interconnectedness. One vendor can create greater risk, and attackers are leveraging that more.
Yeah, I'm looking. The most important thing on this is the lower left-hand corner to me, which is like just like the overall increase in companies who are suffering compromises through a third party or a vendor. And I expect that total number will continue to increase as we see more adoption. Um, what to do about it? Raise your hand if you're watching and you empathize. You're in the 82%. Um, the state, yeah, thanks, Faisal. The state of vendor management is kind of painful still today, and this is just like state of the art. This is an RSA report from. We tried to link, by the way, it might be tough to read, but we tried to link back to all of like the research and the sources for a lot of these stats. And thank you to Jeff Lesser, who's our product marketing lead, who put this together and did all this research. But yeah, this is just like this is from 2020. This is a current number, um, and we won't go too much into this. Just to say that like it's fragile, it's full of friction. It's by fragile I mean like error prone, and it's hard to tell if you're looking at a spreadsheet. It's hard to tell like is it up to date? Is it correct? Has it been updated? Um, it's tough to get a picture of information across when you're vendor management. Your picture of that vendor security is kind of just like stuffed in a Google Drive folder somewhere. But that's the way it is for almost everybody. Okay, this is a visualization. This is what I woke up thinking about. So I subscribe to a bunch of sort of newsletters. The one who's reading today was the Washington Post has a cybersecurity newsletter called 202, and they've been reporting the SolarWinds breach and following along with it. And like the entire newsletter today was just about the impact and the fallout of SolarWinds here, what it'll mean for a Biden administration that has control of the legislature, whether there may be coming cybersecurity legislation. There's a much I haven't seen much analysis about this, but there's a much vastly improved chance that you're going to see like a privacy legislation in the United States, which was not just surprising because I thought there would be political gridlock around that for a long time. But we'll see. The visualization here, or part of what this is intended uh, to represent, is that there's two stats here. There's 2/3 of security professionals think it's possible or definite that they suffered a breach through third parties, and 60% um, say they have experienced a data breach caused by a third party. And this is trying to get at the fact that you may be or we may be affected by SolarWinds and we may not know it yet. We may be maybe a vendor or something like that. And there's a lot of attention in sort of the media and around in for security attendees. I'm sure pretty much everybody here probably had to do some kind of incident response and customer communications and analysis for SolarWinds and go through a plan. But once you get past that first order of like, is SolarWinds a vendor? And then asking your vendors, are you affected by this? Pretty quickly, it falls off. Pretty quickly, you don't have much visibility into the supply chain after that. Frank, do you have any, I don't know, any maybe like redacted stories of trying to track down like vendors and trying to get responses from vendors and just like experiences from the trenches around supply chain and trying to understand, either before or after an event, whether, Aptable's at risk?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we can talk about this specific example of the Orion hack. So for those of you who aren't familiar, SolarWinds Orion is a server monitoring software. So it's an agent that runs on servers, and that puts it in a position of having an extremely high degree of privilege, where if it's compromised, the attacker can laterally move and attack a lot more resources. So one of the first things that we heard with the SolarWinds hack was how vendors like Microsoft were compromised too. And there were plenty of customers, Microsoft customers, who were victims of the attack, who they had never heard of SolarWinds, they had never paid for a SolarWinds product. And so similarly, we had to go to all of our vendors, anybody who we were using to process sensitive data, and ask them if they were impacted by the SolarWinds hack. And at that point, you're relying on a high degree of partial information and taking these vendors at their word. Taking really the best we could get is an attestation from the vendor saying, no, we don't use Orion, and to our knowledge, none of our vendors used Orion. That's about the best you can do, and it's pretty challenging. It's very manual, doesn't give you a high degree of confidence. And we did this with SolarWinds, but there are many supply chain attacks that we've had to handle in a similar way.
Yeah, I see this whole set of issues, like it's like it's going to keep happening. They're going to keep getting bigger. They're going to keep um, this is going to continue. Their internet is becoming even more adopted. Uh, Cloud services and technologies in a lot of ways. I haven't seen any research on this, but I think go through sort of innovation and consolidation cycles. But I think we're going to still continue to see like more and more and more vendors that hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of companies use. And security is going to remain a challenge. It's not, if a breach is going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And how bad will it be when it happens? And how fast can you recover? Um, Yeah, some stats here again, like more sort of, if you're feeling like this, that you don't have the resources to monitor security and privacy of vendors, you're not alone. You're in the majority here. A lot of times this kind of falls by the wayside, and it's like, well, what can we do? We can pull a SOC 2 for every vendor. We could make them go through our vendor security questionnaire again, but it's each of these actions are often high friction for you. Who's going to do that? You're going to hire an associate to do it? Or are you going to, who's going to go ask for the SOC 2 from every vendor? Who's going to go chase down the security questionnaires? And you can buy software, and you can you sort of hire service providers to help with some of that stuff. But straight up, like, it still takes time and money, and most companies still don't have that time and money. Um, the like, as we were saying before, three-quarters feel like they of people feel like they don't have visibility into um, where their data is going. I would be surprised if this says data and personally identifiable information. Yeah, I could see. I mean, especially as the company gets bigger, it's like, do you know all the services, and what is the sales team hooked up to Salesforce, and where is your data potentially connected? What integrations do you have connected to which systems? And feeling like you don't have like a good handle on that. You have a known state often of like what you think should be the case, what's approved at least, or like what is supposed to be the case, but it's really tough to understand like what is the actual state of where is your data actually versus where should it be. And the last one here is again like all of this leads to if you don't have the resources to like get visibility and you know that you're sort of operating in, I don't know, I think of like video games, like the fog of war, where it's like there's only a certain distance that you could see, and beyond that, it's just like blocked off. You're operating in this, um, and of course, it leads to a lot of uncertainty. Um, I don't know if there's anything. I mean, around. I guess in here, I'm going to turn off the slides for a second. We'll talk about the prediction here. And the prediction is, just to remind everybody, it says data networks increase vendor risk. So Frank, do you want to talk about like we've talked about a lot about like the problems here? Like what's the opportunity, or what do we see opportunity for in the market right now?
Yeah, so the as we were talking about, there is this interconnected network of cloud vendors who are providing services, and it's kind of like uh, it just like layers and layers of cloud services all the way down, and it's tough to know when you hit the bottom. Um, Privacy frameworks like GDPR introduce some better ways to analyze this. With GDPR, every company ends up publishing a list of their sub-processors. And so you can actually dig in and understand if you navigate that data, okay, if I'm using Twilio for SMS, what does that mean for the data that I'm sending to Twilio? Who is Twilio using to process that data? And you can start digging in. So we're starting to inch towards this kind of world in which it's actually transparent to see how your data is being used by not only your vendors, but by their vendors. And so we think that there's an enormous opportunity here to basically create greater transparency by giving vendors a way to kind of represent what they are doing from a security and compliance perspective, propagate that to their customers, and allow their customers to repropagate that. So basically, everything now that is hidden can become more public if there's a good, consistent way to do this. That's going to have to be better than PDF SOC 2 reports. It's going to have to be better than navigating the text of GDPR sub-processor directories. But there is the opportunity for a technology-powered way to do this. You can think of it as kind of like contact tracing for vendor risk, right? So one of the most effective ways to track the propagation of viruses in the real world is to understand who comes into contact with whom. Right now, that data for uh, how data is used between cloud vendors doesn't exist. It easily could, and if that were to emerge on a platform, it would make vendor risk calculations a lot easier.
Why
So that's what
haven't
we imagine
any
happening.
There are companies that work on vendor risk management. So there's a whole Gartner category of IT risk management. Sorry, I realize I drink from my coffee mug, and my coffee mug has like it leaves coffee on my nose. So if I have coffee on my nose during this presentation,
You're good.
you can raise
I
your
would I
hand.
would tell you.
Yeah. There's a whole category of IT vendor risk management software. Why isn't like what we're talking about here is basically like it's almost like a version of like LinkedIn, except for people, it's for companies, and except for like career data, it's for like security data. It's for like being able to, you know, exchange documents and exchange security information. And one of the things that if you were able to build a network like that you're talking about here is that you could not only manage your vendors and get visibility over the vendors you have, but also without sort of disclosing relationships between other companies, you could get visibility into whether you're exposed to any other number of vendors, and then some indication of the riskiness of those vendors and your possible exposure or something like that. That's kind of what we're talking about. Why doesn't that exist?
Well, most third-party risk management or IT vendor risk management software doesn't have active participation from the vendors. They're not like first-class participants in those networks, and that's part of what you need here. You need the vendors are the ones who know what they're using. That's not something that you're going to be able to compile from the outside, from scanning, from asking, compiling answers to questionnaires. To get that data, you really need to have the vendors be participants. And so we see that as a kind of a key requirement for this active vendor network.
For those, if anybody's watching, if you ever like answered questionnaire through a portal or something like that, that experience, Frank, when you say not like we're making that a first class experience or that should be a first class experience, can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, I mean that so what we're talking about is we want to we want the vendors who are being subject to risk assessments to be able to provide effectively full disclosure of their risks. Now, it may not include all of the details, it may not include specifically which vendors they're using, but the point is it's coming from them. And so the, the the platform that we have in mind here facilitates both customer trust building by giving vendors a more direct way to communicate what they're doing for security and compliance than say sharing a SOC 2 report, and it gives customers a more direct way to ask questions about security instead of basically trying to sift through a SOC 2 report or sift through a vendor risk database to understand what a company is doing to secure its basically to perform host hardening on its infrastructure. What if a customer could ask that question directly, have it go straight to the vendor? The vendor could answer it directly, but not even on an ad hoc basis. The vendor could tie into their own systems to be able to answer that concretely. So whatever system the vendor is using to manage host hardening, they could plug that into this vendor network and communicate their security control directly to their customers. If you expand that out and you get great adoption from all of the cloud vendors, you end up having all the data you need to be able to trace who's using whom and what risks are present at each kind of node in this network. So that's what we're imagining here. The sort of functionality that this platform would provide would include vendor security questionnaire response. It would include submitting questionnaires and conducting vendor risk management. But the point is, it's both the customers and the vendors are actively using this to store important data that's relevant to them.
Awesome. We're going to move on. Thank you, Frank. We're going to move on to the second prediction here. If anybody has other thoughts or ideas about the emergence of, like social network, but for companies and related to security, let us know. Prediction number 2 here is about automation. Frank, do you want to, there's the next slide here is the Gartner hype cycle. What's the state of the world or sort of compliance automation, this term? Do you want to talk a bit about sort of, I don't know, this the reputation compliance automation has earned and the perceptions of when you read or see something that says compliance automation
Yeah,
in the
for sure.
market?
Yeah, so automation is it's definitely a buzzword, and there's a spectrum in terms of what it implies. One way that we like to think about it is in terms of smart versus dumb automation. Where we are now is closer to what we would call dumb automation. And what that looks like is compliance software like GRC can integrate with software that you're using on the outside to help you marginally or to make it marginally easier to perform manual tasks. So an example of how this could work is GRC software connects with Jira so that when you assign yourself a manual item to review the security groups in your AWS configuration, you can assign that ticket to yourself in Jira. So it's easier to get done. That's an example of where automation or compliance automation lives today. When we talk about smart automation, it's not about integrating with external systems to help kind of conduct manual work, but rather to automate the work that needs to be done. So with that example, in true compliance automation, we're talking about integrating with AWS directly, or maybe integrating with a compliance oversight tool like Prisma Cloud or Cloud Conformity, or even AWS's services like AWS Config, collecting data to demonstrate that your security group rules are in conformance with your security controls, automatically logging that as evidence, tying it back to the controls and frameworks that you need to comply with. And then it's there and ready for you whenever you need to either use it in an audit, or when there's any issue with the evidence and you need to be alerted in order to correct it. But in this new world, like, that's what we talk about as smart automation. It's actually taking work off your plate as opposed to plugging into external systems to make it easier to do manual work. I think, so what this means in terms of this chart that Chaz had, the Gartner, the hype chart, we're probably somewhere past the peak of inflated expectations. So there's this innovation trigger, which is the adoption of both cloud services for running one's business and cloud GRC software, so SaaS GRC, that enabled connectivity via APIs to enable some of these dumb automations. What happened is that it didn't actually make it easier to get compliance work done, or it didn't automate the work away. And so what we're approaching onto is this world in which we actually have these smart automations that take work away, where you have computers running your compliance program instead of humans running it. And that's where we see ourselves going over this next year and beyond.
I think that the reason why Jeff put this is a joke, I think. There's also this is also like something that's used to represent like the startup emotional roller coaster for startups. But the joke here is that, or the idea is that, like, compliance automation sounds good in theory, but at least for the last couple of years, a lot of the companies that we've talked to, and Frank was sort of talking about this, a lot of the companies that we've talked to who have bought compliance automation or have looked at compliance automation have really just been sold like a set of like Slack reminders, essentially, not real automation. That's what we mean by disillusionment. It's like, wait, I thought this was actually going to do like work for me, not just remind me to do manual data entry into a system. And I think where we're at right now is like there's recognition of that in the market. We've seen and talked to hundreds of teams, and the most advanced ones have been, over the last couple of years, investing in security engineering and in like beg, borrow, and stealing engineering resources to build scripts or internal APIs or evidence collection systems or monitoring systems especially for their internal architecture and their SaaS architecture. And I think we're finally starting to see enough like credible competition, companies actually trying to build like real useful automation, that this is going to get better in the next couple of years. Is a huge quote from Coalfire. Coalfire says, or this is from a report, I believe, which is called I think this is the Coalfire Compliance in the Age of Digital Transformation report, which I thought, I'll just share this. If you have not read this, I thought this was great. I thought it was really well done. I recommend you read it. This is commissioned through, I think, like a marketing company called Omdia or something, but Coalfire commissioned it, and it's consumable. It's interesting. It's well, I think it's really digestible. It's a quick read, 25 pages. But I think this is one of the pull quotes from this. Now, of course, Coalfire would say this, like everybody should invest in security. But I think the direction, this is an example data infographic from the report, talking about sort of the upcoming shift in the next couple of years, and this is going to be this is likely. I know that for FedRAMP too, a lot of companies are talking and thinking about FedRAMP. NIST and GSA and the folks who run FedRAMP are thinking about how do we make it easier and more automated and cost less. It has a really nightmare reputation right now as being something that takes a lot of time and resources to do. And I don't think that the federal government is necessarily, they love the barrier to security, but I think they want to make some of these services more accessible. And that's just one example of, across the industry, more and more awareness and the ability to get sort of like credit. That's the way to look at it, between sticks and carrots. The carrot is you get credit for your compliance automation, and it's becoming easier to understand for the auditors and others why your automation or what you're doing should be, indicative of control over information. The stick is like, you're gonna, in a couple of years, you're gonna have to demonstrate the ability to continuously monitor and manage security controls over time. Okay, so this is around, like, when we talk about automation. Frank, do you want to speak to some of these different like use cases around this?
Yeah, for sure. So so when we're talking about automating compliance and connecting to the other cloud services that you're using to run your business, um, the first two almost go hand in hand. The first item is collecting evidence on an ongoing basis. So you might, if you've been through an audit before.
And you know what? While I'm thinking about it, thank you so much, Faisal, for your question. You asked, you said, I'm a CISO for an AWS hosted healthcare SaaS. We have to become high trust certified. How do you help minimize costs? Could you, I mean, we do high trust. We use our own sort of products and tooling. Could you, as you talk through this, also like help talk through like how this applies to like reducing costs for high trust, or how this helps with high trust?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way this works with Comply, so Comply is it has this principle of automate once, use many. And so what we have is we have a standard set of controls mapped across multiple frameworks. We at Aptable undergo annual audits for high trust, ISO 27001, and SOC 2. And so for the high trust audit, the auditor will expect a certain pieces of evidence. And high trust is actually one of the more detailed and rigorous frameworks, where there are very specific controls and specific examples of the evidence that the auditor is going to ask for. So what happens is high trust has this software that they use to manage the audit called MyCSF. We plug that into Comply. That tells Comply what sorts of evidence needs to be collected. Comply plugs into AWS, our other hosting product, Aptable Deploy, our mobile device management, our access provisioning and identity management solutions, all of the services that we use that help us to run our business that need to be secured. And we collect evidence that we're doing so from each of these. So we collect evidence of security group rules being in place in conformance with high trust controls. We collect evidence of proper pull request approval, passing CI on our GitHub pull requests that we can then use to turn over to the auditor as a sample of our compliance on secure software development lifecycle, and so on. And all of these are happening automatically, right? So you set up an integration once, you define the rules, well, you tweak the rules that we predefine to say what constitutes as evidence that you want to collect. And then you set rules for when you want to be notified of a potential exception to your security controls. And that's this second piece, and continuous system analysis and control monitoring. So if you're collecting evidence of what you're doing right on an ongoing basis, you can also set up notifications for when you're not doing something right, so that you can address this ahead of time. Now, I'm gonna go out on a limb and I'll raise my own hand here, but I'm curious how many of you have been in an audit and realized that there was an exception or a nonconformity during the course of the audit. Now, I'll raise my hand. I've been in that situation, and I would suspect that most have also been in that situation. And this is how it works, right? The status quo is to conduct evidence collection as part of an audit. And so if that's the way you approach this reactively in response to an audit request, that's the only time that you're going to find out these issues. If you're collecting evidence continuously, you can also be alerted to issues continuously and address them before you go into an audit. And so those are kind of like the two parallel pillars of how we see compliance automation working. We also see, there are specific details of compliance automation that tie into how we manage our own applications. Basically defining our software development lifecycle and our DevOps processes in terms of infrastructure as code, having compliance and security built into our continuous integration and deployment so that we're basically automating certain steps in what we run on our CI platform, documenting the steps that happen so that we have a record. These are all kind of what goes into automating our compliance activities proactively.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I guess the point I want to drive home here is that there are different capabilities, and Frank mentioned this around point number one here is evidence collection. And when the audit comes, like if it's high trust or something, and these are great questions. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Faisal. Nick asks, out of interest, what's your annual audit bill? We do SOC 2 Type 2, ISO, and high trust every year. We pay about 30K for SOC 2, 50K for ISO, and 50 to 60K, I think, for high trust. So all told, audits, we budget about 150,000 a year for audits, but we also have a bunch of other costs. We have pen testing, we have an internal compliance and security team. The total program, I think, runs just under $1 million a year. So auditing is about 15% of the overall sort of budget and security posture. I hope that helps, Nick. Faisal asks, Hydra says 650 controls or so. How many do you handle through Comply? And does Comply help with automating the CI/CD process? Yeah, it really depends on what. So your controls for something like high trust depend on the systems that you're using, and for the amount of coverage that you get from something like Apply, it depends on like, well, what integrations. If you're trying to protect PHI, it's like, where do you keep PHI? It really depends a lot on your business. So it may be you may get a high amount of coverage, or you may have, if you have, I don't know, a lot of maybe you have like an on-prem data center or something, and it's like it's going to take a lot more work to get something like that high trust compliant. But if you're using like typical, core popular SaaS systems, you can get an enormous amount of coverage through Comply. Although that's probably better for a separate webinar. But great question. With automating CAC. Frank, can you talk a bit too? So there's evidence collection, which is like, okay, it is February, everybody. It's time for you name it, like high trust recertification. Let's go get the evidence. That's point number one, making that easier and making that more automated. Point number two is between audits, right? Like, okay, it's the middle of the summer. The audit's not till next, but like, are we finding and preventing exceptions? Are we sort of, keeping things buttoned up? And then the last sort of point here is specific to SDLC and specific to especially infrastructure. Like, it's enough of a category that it gets its own
Yeah.
sort of its own.
This is so. I mean, this is maybe where there's the greatest maturity. There's a really good report, and I'll grab a link. The Puppet State of DevOps from 2020 is all about building. It's about DevSecOps and building security and compliance controls into your CI/CD pipeline, and it talks about the maturity model there. And because there's so much intrinsic risk in the software that a SaaS company builds themselves, as opposed to the software that they buy from their vendors, there's a special focus there. At Aptable, we have an entirely separate product called Deploy that helps manage that, where Deploy, it basically puts guardrails on top of an AWS deployment in order to both manage the CI/CD process and then secure all of the interactions with those resources once they're hosted on AWS. So there's, I don't think we can go into all of the details of how folks secure CI and CD pipelines and how they use that to enforce controls around change management, infrastructure security. But I will drop a link to the Puppet State of DevOps report, which I would highly recommend. Like that Coalfire report, it's a really great read.
I think it's interesting as a last note on sort of, well, actually, this is directly related to our last prediction. We can just go into it. What I was going to say is that I think it's interesting to see and encouraging to see like AWS shipped like 3 or 4 new security products and monitoring products in the last year, and there's been more and more. You know, if you're looking at like what's the story of I'm thinking like, I don't know, 2012 to 2015, it's like unsecured S3 buckets, dumping secrets in GitHub repos, just like kind of dumb, sloppy stuff like that. And what you've seen is GitHub introduce token scanning in the platform. You've seen AWS start to introduce, you know, more security tools and monitoring in the platform. And I think this is kind of, I don't know, a broad theme that we're going to see more and more and more of today. So this is our third prediction. So platforms overtake point solutions. I think we're going to see continued like interest in platform adoption, and we'll explain a bit about what we mean. This is, as I said, this is like all of the, specifically around like GRC and managing compliance, that kind of stuff. Often you see a lot of fragmentation, a lot of your security posture and the information that is represented and your ability to interpret information from that is kind of blown across all these different systems. I like, is this the messages? This is like, I don't know what this is. This is a generic chat, but this is like, yeah, text message. Okay. How many of you have conducted an audit over text message? This is kind of like a representation of what we see out there. We talked to a lot of companies who are like, yeah, we're using like 10 different systems to collect all of our different logs and asset inventories and do workflows and collect evidence and manage vendors and on and on and on. And I think that the biggest pain that we see is that these don't talk to each other. They don't integrate well. They don't talk to each other well. They're not aware of what you're trying to do. And the sort of the emergence we see, this is particular to GRC. Frank, do you want to talk a bit about sort of like, I mentioned before, I think a lot of companies out there in this space are ultimately building features and not platforms. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so I mean, our approach here and what we believe in is that the core data that powers your compliance program should all live in one place. So an example here is, so we take a risk-based approach to identifying new controls. Imagine a world in which you basically identify a risk. So a vulnerability is reported. This surfaces a risk in the way that your system is built, and you define a risk treatment to track it. If you're using point solutions, you might have one software that you use for risk management where you document the risk. You might track the risk treatment in a totally separate system, maybe use Jira for that. If you wanted to understand how this tied back to your assets, you might be using something like Asset Panda or another asset management system. If you want to monitor that what you're basically like after you've implemented this risk treatment, that it stays in place and you are not regressing, you probably have another system for doing that, some sort of security monitoring. Ultimately, you have all of these systems, and it's really hard to track whether you are actually meeting your security controls and objectives. And it's really hard to then easily communicate that to stakeholders like customers and auditors. And so that's why we believe that all of these core pieces, so the assets you care about, the vendors that you're using, the policies that you have in place and how that translates to security controls, the risks that motivate them, the evidence that you're collecting to prove that you're effectively managing your controls. Having them all in one system connected together means that you can work much more effectively. And by effectively, I mean not letting things slip through the cracks, which is really what happens when you're using this loosely connected mesh of point solutions.
Yeah, mostly great point here. Thank you for bringing that up. The visualization that would probably represent this, if I would do a V2 on this, what I'd represent is like the solutions that you prefer to use would be like connected to the sort of central hub of like a common platform. So if you want to use, Lupio, or you want to use Asset Panda or Snipe, or for like Jamp, your device management or whatever, like on and on and on. But right now, the biggest problem is not like where those workflows occur, but that the data and the workflows aren't connected. So if you're using Lupio over here and something else over here, they don't talk to each other. Um, Rather than trying to, yeah, like you said, like build, best in class. You can't build a platform that has best in class experiences for everything. And so that's where integration comes in really strong. But right now, most companies don't have that centralized, system to connect things to make connections and to associate stuff. Um, so I have a couple questions here. I mean, one thing is like more broadly, there is a shift. I think there are some platforms, and we could discuss. I think AWS is interesting for not specifically to GRC, but for a lot of the platform strategy that they're. I mean, that's been pretty clear for decades. They've been working on a platform strategy, but I think in particular the recent focus on security tooling and is going to continue. I'm excited to see that. I think that there are other companies. I actually wanted to, and I think like OneTrust in particular has within GRC or within compliance management has been like more forward looking, probably because they got a bunch of market adoption with GDPR, and then of like I think like the correct strategy is like, okay, you have a privacy management set of modules that work well. The natural extension of this is like build out more functionality for companies to be able to do things that are privacy adjacent, like security monitoring, vendor monitoring, and they've done that. The strategy that they've taken is raise a lot of money and build not like if you talk, I don't know how many of you raise your hand if you've used OneTrust, Vendorpedia, or some of the other non-privacy management products. You can render your own judgment. Your mileage may vary as to product quality and use case and stuff. It can be good if you're looking for a basic experience, and it can break down pretty quickly. If you're not. And I think like what they've done is said like, this is all part of the vision, and we're going to build basic experiences for a bunch of different parts of this vision of a larger platform. I think the danger for them is that which is that what Mosi had pointed out, which is that most of the experiences on OneTrust's platform are not best in class at all by far. But if somebody can come along and build a set of platform experiences that are either integrate better or somehow provide sort of better experiences and more maturity and visibility, there's a big opportunity, I think. Okay, we have 8 minutes left. I wanted to make sure we have time for any other questions or things like this. I know that we have, yeah, if you want to learn more about Aptable and everything we're doing, all of these predictions basically relate to, what we're building. These are our predictions because They are the biggest things that we think are relevant opportunities over 2021. So over the course of 2021, we're going to be building and launching and being more open about the vendor risk management network that we are is sort of the core of our strategy adaptable. We have a whole bunch of like really interesting compliance automation work that's been released in the last 6 months and is coming out in the next year or two, especially around infrastructure and automating sort of monitoring and change management of your crown jewels. And in terms of platforms and point solutions, really what I said before is what I meant. I think that there's a case for having one system that can pull everything in from your various vendors or your various experiences and allow you to both sort of become trustworthy and generate trust, and then also share that with customers and communicate it out better and faster as part of this network. Okay, other questions here? Let me see. I'm going back through and seeing if we missed anything. So we had questions about high trust and costs and audit costs. If anybody has any other, I don't know, questions or things you're thinking about.
Mostly just asked one in the Q&A tool. Great question. Thanks for asking this. So Mosi asks, you mentioned FedRAMP automation earlier. That work will be based on OSCAL, the Open Security Controls Assessment language. How important is a common taxonomy and language that is both human and machine readable to achieving the platform vision you outlined? Since I read the question, I'll give my crack at an answer here, and then I'll let Chaz weigh in. I think this is a great question, and I think it's very important. And one of the main reasons why you need this common taxonomy and language is so that customers and vendors can speak the same language, and that whatever, so OSCAL was primarily built so that auditors would have a common framework for understanding and assessing compliance with FedRAMP controls. That same sort of common language can be used for customers to ask specific questions of their vendors that are important to building trust, and vendors to answer them in a consistent way. If you think of the way that this works right now, the state of the art is still most companies use spreadsheets to conduct their vendor security questionnaires. Some use software. It's almost entirely free form. There is very little in the way of customers and vendors meeting in the middle on a common set of basically control assessment questions and using that as the basis for building trust. If we can find a control assessment language, a taxonomy like this that's used by both customers and vendors, it means that you could instantly get an answer to the questions that you have for your vendor, because they've already prepared all of their security controls in line with that same framework. So if you want to know what your vendors are doing for background checks or what they're doing for secure software development lifecycle and code approval, you can ask those questions according to a control assessment language like OSCAL and get the answers back instantly. You don't have to wait. There's no error in going back and forth. You don't have to spend time sifting through their text response to understand whether it meets your criteria. I see this relationship.
Until then, though, humans need to be able to understand, what am I looking at and why should I trust you? And so that's a future state of compliance adoption and standardization that doesn't exist today, where it's like, how can I trust you? Oh, it's like, have your computer talk to my computer. Have your vendor management API talk to our customer trust API, and you can find out quickly. We're pretty far from that still today. There's appetite for that, but in terms of execution, you still have to be able to sit a human being down, whether it's an auditor or a customer, and they have to understand, okay, what am I looking at? What are you saying? What does that mean? Like, what are you representing this control is? What does that mean in terms of the scope of your systems and risks? And how do I know what I'm looking at is accurate? How do I know that it's complete? whether it's evidence or an attestation or something like that, and that still takes human judgment, and I think that's going to be the case for a while. I think you're gonna see things like FedRAMP get sped up, and OSCAL do a lot in terms of reducing the manual work required to build and maintain a system security plan, and the ability to sort of manage the administrative overhead of FedRAMP. But there's still going to be a human being sitting down and saying, asking themselves, do I understand this? Does this make sense? Do I get it? Does this seem pass my test for reason? Ideally, those who've been through vendor management and audits may not agree that reason is the highest currency in one of those processes. But yeah, that's the world I want to live in. Have your vendor management API, talk to my customer trust API. More to come. Stay tuned. Aptable 2021. Thank you, everybody. It's 9 o'clock. Really appreciate you attending, carving out a chunk of your Monday morning. Here, there are, as Rebecca mentioned, other resources. And if you want a demo of any of our products or want to hear more about our roadmap or what we're working on, just give us a holler. Rebecca?
Yep, thanks so much. You summed it up nicely. Everyone will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as some of the resources that we mentioned, like the Coalfire Report, et cetera. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, sales@aptable.com, or you can sign up for a demo on our website as well. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Bye now.